Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into this stack about the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Looks like we've got some serious deep dive material here. You really went all in.
Well, it's 1968, right? Kind of hard not to get sucked into all the craziness.
Oh yeah, for sure. This is like peak, what is even happening in American history?
Exactly. Like assassinations, protests, Vietnam, it all just kind of explodes at the DNC, you know?
No kidding. Makes you realize how connected everything really is, huh? Like those assassinations, MLK and RFK, just boom, boom, one after the other.
Right. And everyone's already on edge, right? And then the Vietnam War just keeps dragging on, protests getting bigger and bigger, tensions higher and higher.
Plus, you've got the whole counterculture movement exploding. Like this huge generation clash, all these young people saying nope to the old ways.
And right in the middle of it all, you've got Mayor Daley in Chicago. Tough guy, old school, law and order, not exactly the type to back down from a challenge, right?
He really wasn't. 12,000 police officers, National Guard troops, even banned marches. Like, wow.
Talk about a recipe for disaster, right? It's like he wanted a confrontation. You've got Daley and the whole Democratic establishment on one side trying to project this image of unity and control.
All the world's watching, no less.
Exactly. And on the other side, you've got all these different protest groups all united against the war and the status quo, but with totally different approaches. You've got your notes on the MOBE there, right?
Yep. The National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Super organized, big coalition of anti-war groups.
Yeah, serious folks, really strategic. And then, well, you can't forget the Yippies, total opposite, right? Youth International Party, all about the spectacle, the provocation.
Oh, yeah, those guys. I can't believe they actually wanted to nominate a pig for president.
Pigasus, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hilarious, but also kind of tragic. It really sums up the disillusionment a lot of young people felt, like the whole system was a joke.
It's wild how those two groups, so different, ended up in Chicago at the same time. Added a whole other layer of tension for sure.
Yeah.
But do you think Daley's, like, the iron fist approach actually made things worse?
Oh, absolutely. Trying to suppress dissent like that just fueled the fire, created this climate of fear and resentment that, well, it practically guaranteed an explosion.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, almost. And explode it did. You've got some pretty intense descriptions of the clashes between protesters and police. It got ugly fast.
Yeah. Peaceful marches turned into full-blown chaos, tear gas everywhere, police just swinging batons. Some even took off their badges so no one could identify them. Brutal.
There's this one quote you highlighted from a British journalist. It's chilling. He says, "The kids screamed and were beaten to the ground by cops who had completely lost their cool. They were hit in the genitals by cops swinging billy clubs."
Wow. Talk about a visceral image, right? Like this wasn't some far-off war zone. This was happening in an American city on camera for the whole world to see. Crazy how things spiraled.
It is. But then you got this Gallup poll from right after the convention. Get this. 56% of Americans actually approved of how the police handle it.
I know, right? Mind-boggling. But it shows how divided the country was. So many people were just exhausted by the protests, the chaos. They craved stability, order, and to them, the police represented that.
So some saw those images from Chicago and were horrified, while others saw the police restoring order.
Exactly. Two completely different realities. And that's where things get really interesting, politically speaking, because, enter Richard Nixon, running for president on a law and order platform. Talk about perfect timing.
Wow, yeah, he tapped right into that fear, that desire for a strong hand. And the Democrats. They look weak, divided, unable to control the streets.
Exactly. And it worked, right?
Yeah.
Nixon's victory, it was a turning point for American politics. Ushered in this whole new era of conservatism, a direct response to the 60s and all that, the perceived chaos.
So the 68 DNC, it wasn't just about a convention. It literally reshaped the political landscape. But it's bigger than that, isn't it? Looking at all this, it's clear the legacy of this thing goes way beyond just elections.
Oh, absolutely. The impact on policing, civil liberties, the way we think about protest, it's still with us today.
All right, let's get into all that. This is where it gets really interesting.
You know that term police riot?
Yeah.
It became permanently attached to the 68 DNC. And for good reason. I mean, it forced everyone to confront the reality of police brutality, especially against, people protesting, exercising their rights.
It's those images, right?
Yeah.
The brutality broadcast on TV right there in everyone's living room. I feel like that's when the conversation about police and protest, it really began.
Yeah. No question. Suddenly, it wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Civil liberties, free speech, what's acceptable protest, all these fundamental questions, they came into sharp focus.
And it's fascinating how, public opinion was so split at the time. We talked about that Gallup poll, 56% supporting the police. But I'm guessing it's more complicated than that.
Oh, way more. Look, you can't just lump everyone together. You dig deeper into the research, it's clear. Support for the police, it depended on who you asked. Age, race, how you felt about the war, all of that played a role.
So it wasn't just a simple public versus protesters thing. It was more like, another reflection of how divided America was at the time.
Exactly. The 68 DNC, it wasn't some isolated event. It was like holding up a mirror to the country, showing all these cracks, all this tension.
And it's wild how those same questions, they're still so relevant. Protest, policing, the line between order and freedom. It's like we're still figuring it out.
It's almost eerie, right? How much those images from 68, they resonate with movements like Black Lives Matter, for example.
Oh, totally. That demand for accountability,
Right.
ending racial profiling, stopping excessive force, it's like directly connected to what those protesters were fighting for back then.
And the reactions, they're the same too, right? Polarized. Some people see the fight for justice, others see a threat to order. It's like we haven't really fully learned the lessons from back then.
Well, one thing we can learn looking back at all this is, lessons for activism itself. I mean, the
Yeah.
68 DNC, it showed the power of people coming together, challenging the system, but it also shows how important strategy is, how you present yourself to the public.
Yeah, you've got a note here about the Yippies, right? All their theatrics, Pigasus and all that. Sure, they got attention. But did they win over people who might have been sympathetic to the anti-war cause? Maybe not.
Right. Makes you think, like, what actually works? How do you create real, lasting change? Shock tactics or building coalitions, working within the system.
That's the million-dollar question for activists, isn't it? And the 68 DNC, it just shows there's no easy answer. It's about balance, passion and pragmatism, outrage and a vision for something better.
Looking at all this research you've done, what really jumps out at you? Like, what's the biggest takeaway from the 68 DNC? What should our listener really, really remember from this whole deep dive?
Honestly, what gets me is, how these moments of crisis, they expose the fault lines in a society. The 68 DNC, it ripped the Band-Aid off, right? Vietnam, race, the whole clash between the old guard and this new generation demanding change, all of it, just out in the open.
And those fault lines, they haven't gone away, have they?
Yeah.
I mean, things feel even more divided now than they were back then.
No, you're right, they haven't. But that's why history matters, right? The 68 DNC, it's this reminder that we've been here before. We've faced these kinds of divisions, these struggles, and we got through it. It's like a roadmap, but also a warning.
Like, hey, we can do this, but be careful kind of thing.
Exactly. Look, those protests back then, they were messy, chaotic, sometimes violent, but they helped end the Vietnam War, and they started these crucial conversations about civil rights, about justice. So even in the darkest times, there's hope, there's progress happening.
So it's like, even when things look bad, there's still, a chance for positive change.
100%. The challenge for us now is to learn from 68, to see those patterns, to figure out how to bridge these divides we're facing, talk to each other, listen to each other, find common ground, even when it feels impossible.
That's a good thought, a really good thought. Makes me think, as we wrap up this deep dive, what about our listener? What should they be thinking about? I mean, we've talked about the protests, the violence, the politics of 68. Do they see those same things happening today? And what can we, all of us, learn from the past to make the present, a little less messy? It's weird, right? We look back at history and it's like all these separate events. But the 68 DNC, it wasn't just a blip on the radar. It set things in motion, changed the whole game.
And not always in predictable ways, right? Like, take policing. The brutality in Chicago, it was a wake-up call. People demanded change.
Oh, yeah, you've got that article here, right? About the Knapp Commission, formed in New York a few years later, specifically to investigate police corruption, like a direct result of what happened at the DNC.
And it wasn't just about cops either. The whole idea of protest, how much the government can control it, the limits of free speech, all those questions, they became front and center.
It's like the 68 DNC, it put a spotlight on all these fundamental tensions in American democracy. And that spotlight's still on, even now.
And it goes deeper than just the specific issues. It's about these big patterns of upheaval, the establishment versus the people demanding change, the fight for power, for basic rights. It's a story as old as time, really.
So what's the lesson here for us, for our listener? What should we take away from all this digging into the past?
I think it's about Well, understanding that history is complicated. The 68 DNC, it wasn't good guys versus bad guys, you know. It was messy, chaotic. Everyone had their reasons, their perspectives.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and facts, right? It's about real people, real choices, real consequences.
Exactly. And that's why we do this, right? Deep dives like this, it's about thinking critically, questioning everything, seeing things from different angles. It's important.
Yeah. And it helps us see that the stuff we're dealing with today, it's not totally new, right? It's connected to the past. And maybe by understanding the past, we can figure out how to deal with the present a little bit better.
The 68 DNC, it's a reminder that fighting for justice, for equality, it's a long game. It's about strategy, about learning from mistakes, about never giving up.
And it's about, being an active citizen, paying attention, holding leaders accountable, making your voice heard. It matters.
Couldn't agree more. The echoes of 68, they tell us that our choices, our actions, they can make a difference.
Well, that's a pretty inspiring way to wrap things up, I think. So that's it for our deep dive into the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Thanks for joining us. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure, as always.
And to our listener, we hope this has given you, the new way of looking at this crazy pivotal moment in American history. Keep digging, keep questioning, keep learning. Because the past, it's never really over. It's still shaping who we are, even today.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.